I encourage you through this important forum to imagine a future of peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. And the United Nations fully supports your efforts.
If we work together in partnership, we can achieve our shared ambition.
한반도 평화구축의 의제가 국제평화운동의 한 축으로서 활발히 논의되기를 바라며 가장 첨예한 대립과 전쟁을 경험한 한반도가 세계 속에 희망을 웅변하는 평화의 발신지가 되기를 소망합니다.
The video clip that you watched marked the beginning of the opening ceremony of KGFP 2021. And the video alone showed us what these forums' purpose and direction precisely are. And now, we'd like to officially begin the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2021. Good morning, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. Of course, our viewers from all over the world. My name is Kim Kyung-mi, and I am the MC for this forum. It is a great honor and privilege to be a part of this very important meeting. This year's KGFP marks the 12th of its kind. It is a Track 1.5 multilateral forum hosted by the Ministry of Unification to discuss peace and unification of the Korean Peninsula. And it has been held annually for research experts, civil society activists, and government officials from over 20 countries to participate and discuss issues concerning North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. And the KGFP 2021 is a significant event that allows us to discuss ways to identify and establish a new vision for inter-Korean relations. And we would like to also proactively seek for the path of the Korean Peninsula and the international community all to jointly work on for the establishment of a new order. For 3 days, 2 keynote speeches and 2 special messages will be delivered along with 46 individual sessions with participation from 31 partner institutions at home and abroad. Through KGFP 2021, we hope to discuss ways for peace in coexistence and prosperity. So we would like to ask for your active interest and participation. And now, first and foremost, please welcome Minister of Unification, JEONG, to start the opening ceremony with his remarks. Mr. Minister, please come forward to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big
Good morning. I am Lee Young, the Minister of Unification of the Republic of Korea. I would like to sincerely welcome you all to Korea Global Forum for Peace 2021. This year's KGFP marks its 12th anniversary, and I hope we can pull together practical wisdom and spread consensus by discussing an overarching topic of new vision for inter-Korean relations and community for peace, economy, and life of the Korean Peninsula. Starting today, 46 sessions will be held for the next 3 days. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the officials from 27 institutions from home and abroad and the 300 speakers for their enthusiasm and hard work as you will look into the Korea Peninsular issues from rich and multifaceted perspectives. As I'm raising the curtain of this forum, I am delighted to have the Executive Vice-chairperson of the Peaceful Unification Advisory Council, Hyun, who is a repository of peace and unification issues on the Korean Peninsula, as a keynote speaker. I would like to extend my deep respect and appreciation to His Excellency UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Holy See Secretary of State Pietro Parolin, and WHO Director General Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who are leading the international community through a leadership of co-prosperity and coexistence, for expressing your interest and support for peace on the Korean Peninsula in a special video message. I would also like to convey my particular gratitude to the Honorable Speaker of the National Assembly, Byeong-seug, who took difficult steps to participate at today's KGFP to celebrate this meaningful occasion. He was not able to join us here in person, but I still would like to express my gratitude for his taking part. Furthermore, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome and thank each and every participant for joining this forum aimed at achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you and welcome to all researchers, civil society activists, and government officials who are joining this forum online from all around the world. Distinguished participants, since 1945, the time of division is still ticking on the Korean Peninsula, even after 76 years. However, I think that despite hardships and ups and downs at times, and a stalemate in inter-Korean relations, we have managed to make progress in the relations in a coherent direction, thanks to changes and restructuring in international order, as well as our desire and efforts towards peace. 1991 was an especially turbulent year in history that marked the collapse of the communist bloc. It was also a special period for the two Koreas as well. In September of the same year, at the 46th session of the UN General Assembly, South and North Korea simultaneously joined the UN. The two took the first meaningful steps together as members of the international community. After 3 months, the two sides jointly adopted the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement in December, which stipulated provisions on reconciliation, non-aggression, exchanges, and cooperation. Such efforts are immensely momentous in that South and North Korea finally started to recognize each other as a subject of cooperation and coexistence instead of competition, putting aside the history of hostility and confrontation which was long regarded as the fate of the Korean Peninsula due to the war and division. Since then, a generation has passed, and this year marks the 30th anniversary of the agreement. Now it is time to open a new door of history on the Korean Peninsula, which is an era of co-prosperity, by actively realizing the value of coexistence between South and North Korea. Addressing peace and unification challenges through conflict and competition derived from the war and division is contradictory and ineffective. It is my opinion that laying down the foundation for co-prosperity in Northeast Asia by resolving orders of confrontation and establishing an unwavering foundation for a structure of peace is the only strategy and process that will lead to peaceful unification. Distinguished guests, back in 2017, with the inauguration of the President Moon Jae-in administration, some mentioned the crisis of a war on the Korean Peninsula amid grave military tension and severed inter-Korean relations. However, we were able to lead a new journey towards peace, including denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and establishment of a peace regime and development of inter-Korean relations, beginning with the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. This was possible thanks to the principle of inter-Korean coexistence and co-prosperity based on the spirit of mutual respect. Although the Korean Peninsula peace process is at a deadlock after the collapse of the DPRK-US summit in Hanoi, the South Korean government remains steadfast in its efforts and commitments in a consistent and unwavering manner. More time and effort will be required for unification between the two Koreas, but there should be no hesitation in realizing the good community vision together based on the values of peaceful coexistence and co-prosperity, and I think the sooner it is, the better it is. Especially the common objectives and values of peace, economy, life, and safety are the most substantive goals in which the two Koreas can be helpful to one another based on solidarity and cooperation. This is not for the benefit of one side, but rather it is a mutually reinforcing cooperation for all members of the Korean Peninsula and beyond in Northeast Asia. If, through this process, the people of the two Koreas who have lived different waves of life for decades can experience a time of peace in advance, they can overcome the fear of the path not taken and start substantive discussions on unification. Based on reconciliation and confidence building between South and North Korea, the Northeast Asia region filled with conflict and tension can be transformed into a completely new space guided by principles of coexistence and co-prosperity and founded in orders of peace and prosperity. I think that peace on the Korean Peninsula will provide more opportunities for development and growth not only for the two Koreas, but also for its neighboring countries, and co-prosperity will further strengthen peace in the region. Distinguished guest, the South Korean government hopes to rekindle dialogue on humanitarian cooperation, which protects lives and ensures safety in the two Koreas and builds a healthier community. In particular, threats to humanity such as COVID-19 pandemic and climate change are unlikely to be resolved in the near future, and no one country can resolve such problems alone. I believe there is a need for cooperation with North Korea in areas including food, health, and medicine as they are facing difficult times resulting from the global pandemic, sanctions, and natural disasters. Meanwhile, the Republic of Korea has repeatedly stated that humanitarian cooperation will be pursued consistently without any political or military considerations. The international community, including the UN and the US, have also expressed broad support and empathy towards humanitarian cooperation with North Korea. In particular, the idea that sanctions against North Korea should not aggravate the humanitarian difficulties of the people of North Korea is considered common sense among the international community and is becoming a majority opinion. Humanitarian cooperation should be clearly distinguished from sanctions. Furthermore, at times, more bold and flexible approaches toward sanctions issues are necessary to promote humanitarian cooperation. The South Korean government hopes to promote long-term humanitarian cooperation projects with North Korea in a sustainable manner and ensure broad participation of the private sector, international organizations, as well as NGOs through institutional and financial support. In the process, the government will continue to communicate with fellow citizens and the international community for their understanding and empathy. Distinguished guests who support peace on the Korean Peninsula, now, the Korean Peninsula stands at a historical crossroads between progress and regression. We must resume inter-Korean US DPRK dialogue and cooperation in a timely manner and restart the Korean peace process, thereby setting the wheels of denuclearization, peace regime building, relationship building in motion once again. Now is the time to act. Despite difficult situations, we shall never stop on this path that determines the fate of the Korean Peninsula, nor shall we retreat. I believe now the dialogue table is not too far away, but we have an opportunity to build trust in order to resolve hostility that gets way in dialogue. But we do not have as much time as we would like. Even if the conditions for talks are not perfectly in place, we need to restore communication lines between South and North Korea, and we need to resume talks, and that is the only way we can move closer to the desired objectives of all parties concerned. I hope that today's forum can bring the international community's interest and support for a new path on the Korean Peninsula, and I look forward to seeing more creative ideas on how to develop inter-Korean relations. The South Korean government will also actively support your discussion and activities for peace on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia. I would like to cordially ask for your continued support for peace on the Korean Peninsula, and I wish you all good health and happiness. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for your warm welcome speech. That was very impressive opening remarks given by Minister Lee In-young. Thank you once again for your insightful and wisdom remarks. And next, we'll take a look at a video clip of Speaker of the National Assembly, Byeong-seug, for his congratulatory speech. Please take a look.
I am Byeong-seug, Speaker of the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. Congratulations on the opening of the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2021, hosted by the Ministry of Unification of the Republic of Korea. Launched in 2010, the KGFP is one of the most significant Track 1.5 global conferences in Korea. It has bridged public officials and distinguished scholars from home and abroad to identify diplomatic issues on the Korean Peninsula and pave the way for international cooperation. I appreciate the tireless efforts made by His Excellency Lee In-young and the organizers of this forum. It has been precisely 30 years since the two Koreas simultaneously joined the United Nations and signed the Inter-Korean Framework Agreement. This meaningful agreement is assessed to be a cornerstone to build a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. To date, the two Koreas have engaged in various forms of dialogue and cooperation, including summits, with an aim to open a path towards peace and coexistence, and they have led to notable outcomes. Since 2018, the leaders of South and North Korea have met 3 times. For the first time in history, leaders of North Korea and the U.S. sat face-to-face, not once, but twice. We were able to explore a new path to resolve the North Korean nuclear issue. The restoration of cross-border hotline that had been cut off by North Korea for 13 months rekindled contact between the two Koreas. This created an opportunity to turn the peace clock again for the inter-Korean relations that has remained at a standstill for more than 2 years. The two Koreas must rekindle such momentum for dialogue. With a sense of mission to chart our own destiny, we ought to be consistent and unwavering in pursuing peace process on the Korean Peninsula. We have to restore the bilateral trust first in order for the international community to join us. Cooperation from the international community is essential. During the summit between Seoul and Washington in May, a policy on North Korea was closely agreed upon between the two sides. This opened the door for dialogue to North Korea. We hope that North Korea would not shy away from this window of opportunity for peace. It is also necessary for Pyongyang and Washington to resume summit talks with sincerity. At the same time, we should make a concerted effort to enhance public consensus. The National Assembly will certainly provide necessary support. As Speaker of the National Assembly, I reiterated my proposal to hold an inter-Korean parliamentary meeting during my congratulatory speech on Constitution Day last month. I'm waiting for a response from Pyongyang. The ratification and approval of items agreed between our leaders by the two bodies representing the people of our respective nations would lay the foundation for continuous development of inter-Korean relations. I hope that this forum will find creative solutions to open the door for inter-Korean dialogue and lead the two Koreas to a path of peaceful coexistence and co-prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Park. That was a very remarkable speech by Speaker Byeong-seug. I would like to express my gratitude to Speaker Park for his heartwarming messages. Well, ladies and gentlemen, next, let's take a look at another video containing a special message from Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. The message is titled International Community and UN's Role for Permanent Peace on the Korean Peninsula. So please turn your attention to the screen.
I'm honored to once again send my greetings to the Korea Global Forum for Peace. The forum arrives as we mark an important milestone, 30 years since the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea were admitted to the United Nations. And I applaud the Republic of Korea for being a strong and active voice of peace and security, globally, through the United Nations and on the Korean Peninsula. This year also marks the 30th anniversary of the landmark Reconciliation and Non-Aggression Agreement between the North and South. But this agreement, forged in hope, has never lived up to its promise. This anniversary is a painful reminder of the lack of peace on the peninsula, which is why this forum's theme of peace is so vital. Challenges like COVID-19 and climate change, for example, do not respect borders. Addressing these challenges demands peace, dialogue and collaboration. President Moon Jae-in's proposal to transform the demilitarized zone into an international peace zone is an inspired idea, a sign of hope in a relationship that has seen too little over the last 30 years. The DMZ is a unique and biodiverse natural sanctuary for the peninsula, which is deeply vulnerable to climate change. Creating a protected international peace zone would be a welcome opportunity for the two Koreas to focus on a project of mutual benefit for people, for our planet, and ultimately for peace on the peninsula. For too long, North and South Koreans have looked to another with mistrust and fear. This cannot continue. The United Nations stands ready to support initiatives that can bring people together across the border in dialogue, collaboration and common interest, and take steps towards forging a lasting peace for people across the peninsula. I wish you a successful forum.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move on to the next keynote speech, we're going to take a short break for about 5 minutes. And next keynote speech will be Mr. Hyun, Executive Vice-chairperson of the National Unification Advisory Council. So please look forward to it. So I'll see you then in 5 minutes. Thank you.
So let's take time to take some commemorative photograph. First, Minister Lee Lee-myung,
Thank you very much for your participation. It is now time for us to listen to the first keynote speech of KGFP 2021, titled 30th Anniversary Evaluation of the Framework Agreement between the two Koreas and Vision of Inter-Korean Relations. The speaker is Mr. Hyun, Executive Vice-chairperson of the National Unification Advisor Council. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
개회식에서 이인영 통일부 장관님과
Young, Minister of Unification, and also the UN Secretary General talked about the way forward for us. In order for us to set the right direction, we need to understand today, and to understand the present, we must look back and reflect on the past. And so, in that spirit, I would like to take a look at the basic Inter-Korean Agreement that was signed 30 years ago. I would like to talk about the background of that agreement and the implications of that agreement today. And I would like to talk about the changes in the direction of unification from the perspective of North Korea. And I would like to talk about its South Korea policy as well. I have actually been vaccinated, so I would like to take off my mask since the microphones also have little covers on them. In my presentation, I have many different agreements that I would like to mention and many different dates, and I removed my mask so that I can clearly deliver what agreements and dates I'm talking about. I would like to first begin in the 80s. In the early 80s, China started the process of reform and opening up. And in the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union also introduced and implemented policies of glasnost and petroika. The two major communist countries at the time focused their efforts on boosting their own economies. And as a result, they stopped providing economic and security assistance to their socialist brother countries. This is what happened in the 80s and 90s. As you know, in the Mediterranean island of Malta on December 3rd to 4th on 1989, the Malta Summit between the United States and the Soviet Union was held. And Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev proposed to U.S. President George Bush at that summit that the two countries should put an end to rivalry and confrontation. They did not declare an end to the Cold War, but many international experts see this talk as a starting point to mark the end of the Cold War between the East and the West. Since the mid-1980s, Eastern Europe's socialist regimes started to collapse, or many of them started to see a transformation in their regimes. And East and West Germany saw a rising spirit of unification in their societies. As you know, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed, and in the following years, the two Germanys united. And this was the international environment which inevitably stirred up a sense of crisis in the North Korean regime. In particular, due to China and the Soviet Union's decision to cut off foreign aid, North Korea's economy continued to grow 0% in the 1980s. And starting in the early 1990s, North Korea started to post negative growth. As the South Korean economy achieved remarkable success, on the other hand, since the mid-1970s, the gap in national power between the two Koreas continued to widen. And so in the 80s and 90s, the gap in the national power was quite immense. Meanwhile, on July 7, 1988, then South Korean President Roh Tae-woo announced the Special Presidential Declaration for National Self-Esteem, Unification, and Prosperity and pushed for negotiations to establish diplomatic relations with China and the Soviet Union based on his administration's North Korean policy, or rather Northern policy. So as a result, South Korea establishes official ties with the Soviet Union in 1990 and with China in 1992. So with these shifts in international affairs and the widening gap in its national power relative to South Korea, the North likely had little choice but to take extraordinary measures to ensure the security of its regime. And so, if you look at the New Year's address in 1988, you can see North Korea's strategy towards South Korea changing. In that New Year's address, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung states the two Koreas should adopt a non-aggression treaty in which each side promises not to invade the other. We should solve the issue of unification on the foundation that the North and the South acknowledge each other's existence. I think what is notable here is that he uses the term neutral somewhere in this statement, but the point here is that the North says that the two Koreas should adopt a non-aggression treaty. In the late 1980s, the two Koreas held Prime Minister talks and also Vice Ministerial and working level talks. And the talks that took place in September 4th, 1991 were thanks to Vice Ministerial and working level talks between the two Koreas. President Roh Tae-woo in September 11th proposed the Unification Plan for One National Community. And this was in response to a similar plan announced by North Korea earlier. But this plan proposed by Roh Tae-woo serves as an important opportunity to change the North's strategy against South Korea later on. If you look at the Unification Plan for National Community, it is comprised of three phases: a phase of reconciliation and cooperation, a second phase of the Korean Commonwealth, and a third phase, final phase, of unified Korea of one nation and one state. In the Kim Dae-jung administration, the name of this plan changes. However, the three phases remain in place, and the final phase, or the second phase, includes a Korean Commonwealth. Before this plan was shared at the National Assembly, the political leaders of Korea at the time, both the ruling party and the opposition party, were on board with this plan. So this is considered a unification plan for Korea since President Roh Tae-woo, and it continued on until the Roh Moo-hyun administration. On January 1st, 1991, the minister talks were held in the previous year in December, and after these talks were concluded in the New Year's address in 1991, Kim Il-sung says something rather shocking. In that New Year's address, Kim Il-sung says that unification should occur under the principle that no one eats whom or no one is eaten up. And he talks about how we need a loose federation system or loose federal system as a direction for unification. All this demonstrates that North Korea's unification plan has transformed from the inter-Korean federal system announced on August 14th, 1960, and the Korea federal system, which was announced in 1973, to the proposal for founding the Democratic Confederal Republic of Korea in 1980. And finally, the loose federal system as of January 1st, 1991. So we can see how North Korea's unification plan has evolved. Since then, the loose federal system has been expressed as the low-level federation in the June 15th South-North Joint Declaration issued during the Inter-Korean Summit in 2000. And ultimately, what this shows is that North Korea's unification plan has come closer to the core concepts of the Korean Confederation in the South's unification plan for one national community announced in September 1989. And in 1991, South and North Korea jointly joined the United Nations. North Korea had consistently refused to join the United Nations simultaneously. South Korea had continued to encourage the North to do so. But North had consistently made a counteroffer to attain the UN membership under a single country name as one nation following unification. However, in 1991, North Korea submitted its application to the UN voluntarily in 1991, and that year the two Koreas finally joined the UN together at the 46th UN General Assembly. That shows a definite move away from the one Korea notion, and you can see that the North's view of unification changes drastically from that point on.
So in December 13, 1991, the basic inter-Korean agreement was adopted, and we need to take a look at it a bit more in detail. So it talks about reconciliation and non-aggression between the two Koreas, as well as exchanges and cooperation and so on. There are a total of 25 articles in the agreement. And the first 5 articles were critically needed by North Korea. So the 5 articles basically talk about respect for each other's system and also not meddling in each other's internal affair. And also no interference, nor slandering or defaming each other. And Article 4, refraining from any acts of sabotage or insurrection against each other. And Article 5, abiding by the present military armistice agreement until a state of peace is realized. So basically, the two Koreas would respect the ceasefire line or the armistice line. So the changes in view of unification in both North and South Korea can be significantly seen by the fact that the agreement actually contains the official names of the countries and the official job titles of the signatories. Back in 1972, the July 4th North-South Joint Statement was stated, and it states that
위원장 당시 조선노동당 조직부장이었습니다.
Lee Hoo-rak and Kim Young-ju, who will uphold the will of our leadership. So Kim Young-ju and Lee Hoo-rak were the representatives of the two Koreas in signing the joint statement, and there were no indication of the country name or the official job titles before the basic agreement. However, in the basic agreement, signatories were stipulated as Chung Won-sik, Prime Minister of the Republic of Korea, and Yeon Hyung-mook, Prime Minister of the Cabinet of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The fact that the official name of the countries and official job titles of the signatories indicate that the two Koreas recognize each other as official nations, two separate nations. So Article 1 through 5 of the basic agreement were mechanisms to ensure that the North Korean regime would be safe from South Korea. And of course, this also served as an opportunity for us to see how much the North Korean regime was terrified at its instability and unification by absorption. So Kim Young-hwan, the chief liaison officer at the time, told me this directly. So when he was running the liaison office in the mid-80s, he and I had some close relations. And when I was in Beijing in 1995, I think we had a week-long talks then, and there were a lot of breaks in between. And he and I were talking about a lot of things, and he suddenly said, you know, on the day that this basic agreement was signed, Kim Il-sung sent an helicopter to Pyongyang to gather the representatives of the talks to the presidential palace. And at the entrance, Kim Il-sung stood there to greet the representatives and brought them to his room. And he said, "This agreement will help us hold our enemies back. It will give us more power than thousands of troops and horses." So Choi Bong-chun, the chief liaison officer of North Korea, told this to our South Korean counterpart, who told me this story. So this is a very significant story. It will help us hold our enemies back. It will give us more power than thousands of troops and horses. This story provides us a glimpse of how much Kim Il-sung feared of the instability in the regime and unification by absorption. And in 1991, the simultaneous joining of the United Nations by two Koreas is also significant. They joined the United Nations under official country names, which indicated that the two Koreas officially became two separate Koreas. So, the 8th Party Congress of the Korean Workers' Party that was held in January, the party bylaw was revised significantly. It was mostly the provisions on South Korea that were revised. To date, or up until the 7th Congress, the party bylaw stipulated the present purpose of the Workers' Party rule as followed: building a strong and prosperous socialist nation on the northern half of the republic, and executing on a national scale meaning including South Korea, the task of the national liberation, people's democracy revolution. And the ultimate purpose is, communizing the Korean peninsula. But on the 8th Party Congress, through which the party bylaw was revised and adopted, the provision was amended as follows: building a prosperous and civilized socialist society on the northern half of the republic, and realizing on a national scale, which means once again, including South Korea, the independent and democratic development of society. So basically, the term national liberation, people's democracy revolution has been deleted from the bylaw, which I will mention again if I have time to. So this national liberation of people's democracy revolution on a national scale had been recognized as concept of red-colored unification or communist unification. And based on that, North Korea conducted provocations and rhetorics or slandering against South Korea. But at the 8th Party Congress, once again, North Korea revised its party rules and used the phrase realizing the independent and democratic development of society. So the words have become much softer. So this gives us a lot of food for thought. But such change is not an unexpected phenomenon. If we look at the New Year's address by Kim Il-sung in 1998, and also the inter-Korean agreement that prevented unification absorption, as well as the 1991 New Year's address, and so on and so on. The North Korean leader mentions that it should not be about no one eating up whom or no one is eating up. And he also noted that we are willing to discuss the gradual approach to complete federal unification. And of course, there are the 1 through 5 articles in the basic agreement, which refrains us from slandering each other or defaming each other, which are all related together. And this is also connected to the loose form of federal system, as well as the 3-phased unification step that was mentioned earlier. So in English, it would be closer to confederation instead of a federation. And North Korea has changed, mentioning in many of its speeches and addresses about accepting the concept of confederation. So with the changes in terminology in the party bylaw, some people are of the opinion that this is nothing but North Korea's disguised peace tactics against South Korea, even the most intellectual scholars. However, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, given the unchanging dynamics in international affairs and the deepening gap in national power between the two Koreas, our GDP is over $31,000 per capita now. However, North Korea's GDP per capita is only about $1,800. So given this big gap in national power, there's no way that North Korea would still stress national liberation, people's democracy revolution. So the gap in national power and changes in international landscape and Korea's rapid increase of status in the global arena, and so on and so on, North Korea would have had to come up with some change strategies to respond against this. So it seems that Chairman Kim appears to have concluded that it would have been a burden to present unrealistic visions such as liberation of South Korea or communist unification to the people. So recently, if we look at the Rodong Sinmun, the North Korean state-owned newspaper, so actually today is my last day as the Executive Vice-chairperson of the National Unification Advisory Council. So this will be my last day to read the Rodong Sinmun. But anyway, Rodong Sinmun really stresses the importance of the youth. As a matter of fact, and it really strictly cracks down on the youth who looks at materials that are related to South Korea, for example, and that was made into a law as well. And after the economic development plan was executed and Changmadang was revitalized, naturally, content or culture of South Korea flowed into North Korea, and that agitated a lot of North Korean youth. So the young people in North Korea's mind out to contribute to national development centering on the party, but they're becoming lax. And therefore, North Korea has conducted a lot of conferences and workshops and so on to solidify the youth. So in that sense, of course, it is impossible, or it doesn't make sense for North Korea to emphasize national liberation, people's democracy revolution. So Kim Jong-un has recognized that North Korea is in an inferior position, and to assure the stability of its regime or the status of its regime, he had to seek for ways to guarantee this and therefore adopt changes. So this is not something that we should just sit still and watch. We need to make use of this. I believe that at this rate, North Korea has given up unification that is led by North Korea. So a North Korea-driven unification is impossible in North Korea's eyes. South Korea is becoming a country that is capable of unification. But in a situation where one Korea has given up unification and wants to maintain the two-country regime, would it really be correct for us to still pursue the strategy of unification? So there is a quote, 장개축에, in the kingdom, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And this was a key tactic of 재갈공명, which says that we should build our strategies inspired by our counterparts. So a unification policy that bears in mind the possibility of the confederation is perhaps what we need going forward. So as time goes by, the public or the people's passion towards unification has ceased. Young people are not interested in unification. And against this backdrop, peace between the two Koreas and coexistence and formation of a confederation might have to be considered, just like the European Union on the European continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chung Se-hyun, Executive Vice-chairperson of the National Council Unification Advisory Council. As an expert on North Korea, he shared a lot of meaningful talks and stories on how to establish a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula and new vision for inter-Korean relationship. Thank you very much for your insightful keynote speech once again, and we would like to have more talk on his topic. So now Mr. Chung Jin-hyun, professor at the National Institute for Unification Education, will moderate the keynote speech. So Mr. Chung Jin-hyun, please.
네, 반갑습니다. 방금 소개받은
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Professor Chung Jin-hyun at the National Institute for Unification Education. I will now carry out a talk with Mr. Chung Se-hyun based on his keynote speech. And I would like to ask you some questions, and perhaps some of them will be a little provocative, but I would like to take this opportunity to ask you some questions. In the last part of your keynote speech, you mentioned something that I would like to touch upon. I am now at the National Institute for Unification Education, so I'm educating people about unification, and I was in the States for quite some time. In this changed environment, listening to your keynote speech, I came to think that we need to change perhaps the way and what we teach about unification. So as a person who has to educate others on unification, I think that perhaps we need to change the concept of unification, or maybe we need to change the term itself. What do you think? Do you think that we should keep the terminology and change the concept, or should we come up with an entirely new terminology? That's a very good question and a difficult one. If we do not use the term unification, I mean, our ultimate goal is unification, but if we keep using unification, I think it gives the illusion that this is something that we can achieve in the very short term. But realistically speaking, unification is a very long-term goal, and I think as time passes, it will become an even more longer-term goal. The two Koreas have not come together very much, but we keep using the term unification. You said you studied in Germany. Yes, I was at the Max Planck Institute. The National Institute for Unification Education was established in the 60s, and it was at a time when the economy started developing, and there was a lot of hope that the South Korean economy would be able to catch up with the economy of the North. And the government at the time decided that education should become a national initiative and strategy, and that was why that the institute was established. So, at the time, the official title was National Unification Board. And so there was a mismatch in the English and Korean name. But if you look at Germany's case, they unified in about 45 years since the division. And the West Germany government had two separate divisions, and they had one division that was in charge of unification, but they did not use the term unification because it seemed like such an unrealistic, faraway goal. So what they focused on was fostering relationships between the two Germanys. So they focused on improving relations between the two Koreas. So it was named the Inter-Germany division. So we use the term Inter-Korean, but they did not use the term inter. They used intra. So that division was specifically dedicated to intra-Germany affairs, highlighting the fact they were trying to foster relations between two entities within one country. And what they did essentially was provide economic assistance to East Germany, and they achieved unification. So if you look at history, Germany did not use the term unification, the grand term of unification, but they achieved unification. We continue to use the term unification. However, the desire for unification on the Korean Peninsula is diminishing as time goes by. And I don't think that we can do away with the term unification itself right away. But I think we can change what we teach. The National Institute for Unification Education is a public organization. Although we cannot do away with the term right now, we do need to emphasize the phases that are needed in ultimately building a unified country. Unification will be something that will have to be dealt with by the future generation. At our generation, I think we need to focus on the exchange and cooperation that will be needed before that.
Yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And in that respect, so for a long time, you've watched the history of the two Koreas. You are a living proof that the Koreas have been divided for so long. And last year, Germany marked the 30th anniversary of its unification, and this year it marks the 30th anniversary of Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. And I think personally, you probably have something to say about that. About the fact that it's been 30 years since the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement was signed, and perhaps this brings back a lot of memories for you. So can you just share your personal thoughts or personal memories or stories? You can be a little emotional too. So at the time when the Basic Agreement was signed, to be honest, I thought that this was a tactic by North Korea to just, remain safe or to avert the current situation. Of course, in 1988 New Year's address, Kim Il-sung did indirectly express his fear of unification by absorption by saying that we should sign a non-aggression treaty and that unification should occur under the principle that no one eats whom or no one is eaten up. And then in 1991, the Basic Agreement was signed. And it didn't appear to me back then that this would be a start of something new. I just thought that because North Korea was cornered, it just wanted to avert the situation by signing the agreement. However, as time went by, I could clearly see that North Korea's attitude was changing. And in retrospect, we have seen changes in North Korea's unification policy and policy towards South Korea changing, and we should take those changes into consideration when we deal with North Korea. If we should not pursue policies based on North Korea that we think we know based on our past experiences, but we should closely observe the changes that went through for the past 30 years and shape our policies based on that. So I had no idea the Inter-Korean agreement would turn out this way. I'm sorry for not having that insight.
I think it's important to identify the changes in North Korea. As a major in anthropology, I think we need to look at this from the perspective of relative culture. North Korea's view on South Korea has changed. They no longer want to lead unification, and the younger generation of North Korea have actually become aware of K-pop, and they have been exposed to South Korean culture. But in the South, I think that there is a lot of hate toward North Korea. And as you have mentioned, the younger generation has lost interest in unification. At a national level, it has been 30 years since the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement, but because the unification is led by the government, it has become more and more a distant concept for the public, and the situation has become very complicated. And the South Korean people, some people oppose unification. How can we close the gap between the two perceptions? The young generation of North Koreans, those in their 20s and 30s, I think that their sense of individualism is rising. The one for all for one kind of attitude is something that the North Korean regime hopes to raise once again. But as you mentioned earlier, South Korea's younger generation, are not that interested in unification. If you look at the per capita income in South Korea, I mentioned earlier that it is 31,000. Generally, if the per capita income rises above $10,000, that's when a lot of people start to foster desire for democracy and individualism. If you look at Korea, the per capita income now exceeds $30,000. So a lot of people center their lives and their values and thoughts around themselves, their lives. And for them, unification is a goal that just seems like a dream. And they are concerned that unification will only entail costs. And that is why there is a lot of hostility or opposition towards North Korea or the idea of unification. I don't want to talk too long about the costs of unification, but this is something that we need to think about. In the mid-1990s, during the Kim Yong-sam administration, this is when we first started talk about the unification cost. At the time, after the passing of Kim Il-sung, there was an imminent sense that there was going to be a collapse of the North Korean regime. And if the North Korean regime collapses, then unification seems to be the natural course of events. And we realized that we would need money to do this. In the case of Germany, the West Germany, starting in the 1970s, invested, if you will, in East Germany, and we realized that the unification costs on the Korean peninsula will be even greater than that amount. And that is when some people started to think that maybe it's better for South Korea if unification didn't happen at all. And this was 20 to 25 years ago. The people who were in middle school and high school then are probably now parents with children who are in elementary school. And in the mid-90s, when the current people in their 30s and 40s were growing up, they heard a lot of concerns about the unification costs, and that is why perhaps in their generation, they are not that much interested in unification. And then with the rise of individualism overall, there is less interest in unification. So there's a theory that unification will entail massive costs. And sometimes this stokes fear. And Japan is the culprit behind fueling this theory, instilling a fear of unification in the Korean people. Without carrying out a thorough analysis, at the time, simple comparisons were made about the cost of unification. In 1991, a Japanese bank published a report, and this was introduced in The Economist, and it talked about the unification cost. And at the time, I remember thinking that the Japanese were really holding us back when it comes to unification. And in that report, it said that the South Korean economy cannot handle the unification costs alone. So Japan must provide financial assistance in the process of unification. And why would we need financial assistance from Japan? And I think that we need to educate people about the cost of unification as well.
Yes, you're right. What I was surprised upon coming to Korea is that more than any other country in the world, I thought that Korea would conduct thorough research on the unification process of Germany, but I noticed that there were a lot of misunderstandings, like the cost of unification that you talked about in the process of unifying under the West Germany's lead. There are a lot of costs were incurred. Yes, it's true. However, when we look at the inter-Korean relations, we do not even make use of the national coffer to provide welfare to people right now anyway. So things are entirely different between Korea and Germany. But of course, there are changes in awareness or perception between North Korea and South Korea. In North Korea, among the youth, they have some sort of admiration towards South Korea. However, South Korean youth are repulsed by North Korea. So there are differences in perception. For us, therefore, we have to, from a cultural point of view, set up a correct understanding of North Korea, get the correct information, facilitate cultural exchange and contact with North Korea and so on. Those might be solutions. What do you think? But if we take a functionalistic approach, which was actually promoted back in the 70s, and also in the meanwhile, or up until very recently, inter-Korean relations was based on these functionalistic rules. But if you look at North Korea's moves towards South Korea these days, yes, it's true that it cracks down on the youth who admires South Korea. They actually execute people or imprison them for 5 years if they were caught watching South Korean materials and so on. And under these circumstances, would we really be able to revitalize inter-Korean exchange? Through cultural exchanges, would we be able to really provide a cornerstone for unification? Because that is what we have been doing, or we had been doing. But if there is a severe crackdown on the youth in North Korea, if we revitalize cultural exchanges among the adult generation of the two Koreas, would that really be helpful? So I know that Minister Lee In-young is having a hard time right now. We are continuously knocking on North Korea's door, but it's not opening. But before this administration is over, I'm sure the door will open wide. So please keep on knocking on that door. But anyway, so rather than providing something that would appeal to the young people, I think it would be necessary that we provide a humanitarian assistance or some kind of aid to North Korean instead. So let's say that, for example, there's BTS, right? All the younger generations raving about BTS. And that's the same for North Korean youth, I presume. So we have to be cautious of that because North Korea, like I said, strongly cracks down on the youth because of that. And our exchanges, cooperation would have to be based on some things that the North Korean regime would not be repulsed at, not those cultural things. And the Ministry of Unification would do that. And of course, the National Institute for Unification Education would have to take care of the youth part. But of course, we have to take into account the reality.
I think we only have time for some final comments by the Executive Vice-chairperson. As you said, this year marks the 30th anniversary of the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. And also the theme of this forum is New Vision for Inter-Korean Relations and Community for Peace, Economy, and Life of the Korean Peninsula. So I would like to ask you for some final comments for participants. Economic cooperation and peace may actually follow the theory of Marx. We need to build the foundation of economic cooperation first, and we can then build upon this peace. And I think that we need to, of course, move forward with economic cooperation and building peace. And I believe that a systematic representation, an institutional representation of this, would be a Korea Confederation. Of course, ultimately, our ultimate goal is unification, but the core is peace, and the way to go to that is to build a confederation first. I think it is time for us to wrap up. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, we were not able to receive questions from the floor. But I would like to thank the executive vice chairperson, and I asked questions for the floor. I would like to thank Mr. Jung Se-hyun once more.
Thank you very much for the wonderful discussions. We really learned a lot from their talk. Thank you once again. So that concludes the opening ceremony, and we're going to take about a 30-minute break from now. In 10:50, from 10:50, session 1-1 through 1-4 will be held in parallel. So we ask for your active participation. Once again, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and our viewers. I'll see you then. Thank you.